Well, welcome everyone to Boston College and to the Feore Family Lecture Series on Jesuit Studies. I'm Father Casey Beaumire. I serve as the Vice President and Secretary of the University and the Director of the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies. On behalf of my colleagues at the Institute, I wish to welcome each of you to this evening's presentation. I want to say a special welcome to my students from my capstone class. We would normally be in class right now, but we have the smartest students of the class of 2025 in our midst. So I'm delighted to have them here today. And I'm especially delighted to recognize John and Janie, friends of the Institute, for whom this lecture series is named. John is a 1968 graduate of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, and he and Janie are proud parents of a member of the class of 2002. And I'm happy that they brought their granddaughter, Caroline, with them today, all the way from Virginia, a senior from high school in Virginia. I hope you come to Boston College. This year is a very special year for the Institute because it's the 10th year of our existence here at Boston College. And we're doing so many great things to advance the field of Jesuit studies and to deepen appreciation of Jesuit history, spirituality, and pedagogy. We wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today in terms of our mission if it weren't for the generosity of friends of Boston College and the Institute. So would you join me, please, in welcoming John and Janie and Caroline and thanking them publicly for their gift of generosity to us. The Institute was founded in 2014 to deepen understanding and appreciation of Jesuit history, spirituality, and pedagogy. And we do that through courses and workshops and publications and scholarly symposia. This evening, we're delighted and honored to welcome Stefania Tutino, who will receive the George E. Ganss of the Society of Jesus Award in Jesuit Studies. And she'll offer brief remarks on this topic: Jesuit Studies in Context, Historical Questions, Historiographical Trends, and Personal Reflections. Her presentation will be followed by a brief interview conducted by two of the Institute's research scholars, Cristiano Casalini and Emanuele Colombo. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that I find to be very remarkable. Do you know that 3 of the permanent members of our Institute are from the country of Italy? Cristiano was the first to arrive, followed by Alessandro Corsi and then Emanuele Colombo. I also want to point out that this year's fellows also come from Italy. Sabina Pavone and Silvia Mostaccio arrived last month, and they'll be with us for the entirety of this semester. All 5 of them live on Wade Street, just off of Commonwealth Avenue. And that means that Wade Street might rival the north end of Boston, as it appears Brighton is developing its own little Italy. Including Stefania, we have 6 Italians with us at the Institute in total, which suggests that we have passed a significant milestone in what appears to be an Italian takeover of the Institute. I can only imagine what our Institute will look like 10 years from now. And then I wrote down, pause for much laughter. Terrible. Don't give him a microphone. I took the liberty of asking our colleague, Paul Grendler, for his thoughts regarding my observation about Italians and Jesuit studies. He said this: yes, I think there's been a renaissance of Italian scholarship on the Jesuits. I think there are several reasons for this. There was little interest by Italian scholars in studying anything having to do with the papacy, Catholicism, religious orders, and so on for a long time after the Risorgimento. And this was because the church, the papacy, and the Jesuits were identified with the Counter-Reformation, that is, the clerical forces, in this view, that stopped Italy from becoming modern like northern Protestant Europe and opposed Italian unification. What scholarship that was there was negative. This point of view was supported and reinforced by Marxist orientation of much of Italian historical scholarship for quite a while after the Second World War. This changed in the past 20 years. Maybe it was because new viewpoints or approaches emerged. Scholars began to look at what was really there in the night of the Counter-Reformation. And I think that John O'Malley's demonstration that there was a lot more to the Jesuits than just fighting against heretics. And once they started looking more objectively at the Jesuits in Italy and Italian Jesuits, they found a fascinating history. Indeed, you can argue that Italy was a part of Europe in which the Jesuits were extraordinarily successful in many ways. There were Jesuit philosophers, mathematicians, literary figures, and so many schools, including the most important Jesuit school in Rome. The Jesuits were generally popular in Italy before 1773. They were suppressed because non-Italian states, especially France and Spain, wanted the Jesuits to be suppressed. They ruled large parts of Italy. Most of the move to suppress the Jesuits came from outside the country. I think that the increased attention by scholars to the non-European world has played a major role in the renaissance of Italian Jesuit studies and their excellent scholars. The interaction of people has become a fascinating topic for scholars. Jesuit missionaries were so important in this. And I think that Italian scholars have always been interested in people, maybe because Italians, beginning with the Renaissance, have always gone out to the rest of the world. So studying how Jesuits encountered and interacted with other cultures has become such an important area for the study of Italian scholarship. Stefania is a marvelous example of this beautiful talent influencing our discipline of Jesuit studies. In her important contribution to the Oxford Studies in Historical Theology series, titled Empire of Souls, Robert Bellarmine and the Christian Commonwealth, a professor of intellectual history from the University of Sussex, wrote, "With exquisite scholarship, theoretical clarity, and commanding historical perspective, Stefania Tutino represents a radical rereading of Robert Bellarmine's political thought. Reading the cardinal in a wider European context, she sets aside the common view of his work as the essence of Counter-Reformation political theology. She finds in Bellarmine a sophisticated theory of Catholicism as spiritual hegemony rather than Carl Schmitt's example of anti-modernity. It's a fine, fine piece of work." Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in welcoming Stefania Tutino as she receives the George Ganss Award in Jesuit Studies, and as she delivers her remarks, Jesuit Studies in Context, Historical Questions, Historiographical Trends, and Personal Reflections. Please.
Thank you very much, Father Casey, for the very generous introduction. Thank you all for the invitation. It's very special. I feel very honored. I've studied Jesuits my whole life, and the RC was actually the first archive I ever visited, and I never looked back. So it's very, I feel flattered, honored, and very grateful for the invitation. So as I gathered my thoughts today on my own experience of studying the Jesuits in the context of the history of post-Reformation Catholicism and on the importance of Jesuit studies today, I thought I would divide these remarks into 4 parts. Each of them is going to make the case for the centrality of Jesuit studies in a different context, starting from the more focused one and going outwards, right? 4 parts in this talk. Part 1. Studying the Jesuits is crucial if you are a historian of early modern Catholicism. Thankfully, the world of post-Reformation Catholicism is no longer the caricature it used to be portrayed in traditional scholarship. Rather, we're finally starting to appreciate the extent to which post-Reformation Catholicism is complex, multifaceted, and characterized by diverse, competing, and sometimes conflicting forces. Repression and reform were equally predominant themes. The pressure to oppose the Protestants was as powerful for the Catholic leaders as the push of expanding the horizon of the Catholic Church beyond what everybody knew and thought possible. And the post-Tridentine Church made as much effort to monitor, control, and reform the clergy and the laity as they did to root out clerical abuses and revitalize spirituality. After a long period of time, as Father Casey was mentioning, in which historians were almost forced to pick between Counter-Reformation and Catholic Reformation, in the last few decades, and thanks in large part also to the work of John O'Malley and other Jesuit scholars, we have been able to see that those features of post-Tridentine Catholicism are not a zero-sum game. Rather, they were intertwined in complex ways. Even topics that used to be clearly marked in the one category or the other are now being revisited and rediscovered in all their complex and multifaceted features. An example of this newly appreciated complexity would be censorship. The early modern Catholic censorship apparatus has been viewed as the perfect embodiment of the repression that, according to the traditional view, characterized post-Reformation Catholicism. In the last decades, however, we are learning that this traditional view must be thoroughly reconsidered. First, most authors that were censored, especially starting at the beginning of the 17th century, were Catholic people whose confessional allegiance was not in question. In those cases, then, censorship was less a form of crude repression than at times a kind of dialogue between censors and authors that wasn't too dissimilar from the dialogues that take place today between authors and peer reviewers or editors. And many of you might know, sometimes those dialogues today are as tense as if they came from the Holy Office. This is exactly why Robert Bellarmine, one of the early modern Jesuit theologians who was most involved in book censorship, once wrote, "I hardly ever read a book on which I don't feel the desire to write a nice censure." This is not the censor as the person who suppresses books, but the censor as the person who engages with them. We also learned important new information about reading licenses, which were the special permissions given to Catholic clergy and lay people to read prohibited books. Namely, we learned that the number of licenses that the Catholic authorities granted, especially after the Clementine Index of 1596, was huge, numbering in the hundreds per year. This tells us something simple but very important. Quite a lot of people in Catholic Europe could and did have access to the learning and knowledge produced in Protestant Europe. All this does not mean, of course, that censorship had no ill effect, because it did. It had serious consequences on those authors whose books were on the prohibited list, and it damaged social and economic relationships. Probably the most conspicuous cultural damage of censorship, in fact, was self-censorship. There is the loss of the works which authors decided not to write for fear of being prohibited. But it does mean that censorship does not equal repression. Rather, it's a hermeneutically, culturally, and socially complex phenomenon that must be investigated seriously, with care, and without preconceived ideological notions, one way or the other. Now, as we approach the world of post-Reformation Catholicism in this new light, and with eyes open to all its facets and complexities, we cannot help but notice that the Society of Jesus was in fact the clearest, and in my mind, most fascinating embodiment of this complexity, as recent scholars such as Marcus Friedrich, who was my predecessor here last year, have been showing. The Society of Jesus is in many ways unique and stands out visibly among other aspects of the post-Tridentine Church. But unique does not mean singular or isolated. The Society of Jesus was an expression of, bless you, and fully embedded in the Catholic Church. And in this respect, it reflects and refracts in fascinating ways the same complexities we see in the Church overall. Jesuits were confessors to kings and queens, but also missionaries in distant lands or working with people at the margins of society. They were pillars of the Roman Curia, but also authors of novel and often controversial works of theology that pushed the envelope of Catholic doctrine. They were massively involved in the post-Tridentine renewal of Catholic spirituality, but hugely invested in controlling mystical excesses. The Jesuits in some were censors and censured. They were close to the heart of power, but also present at the farthest edge of the Catholic world. They were simultaneously guardians, defenders, and reformers of orthodoxy. I personally sampled just a small part of this complexity when I studied Bellarmine, both in his role as censor and in his role as a victim of censorship, when I read Suarez, Lessius, and when I worked on Tomás Sánchez. In all those cases, I saw theologians who were, of course, pillars of the post-Tridentine Catholic establishment. And in fact, in the case of Bellarmine and probably Suarez and Sánchez, one could make the case that their theology was an integral part of the doctrinal structure that made the Catholic establishment. At the same time, however, I saw theologians who were unafraid to move the goalpost, as it were. As much as we all love the word innovation, we know well that being an innovator in early modern Europe was not a good thing. And yet, Jesuit theologians, time and again, pushed the boundaries of Catholic tradition, not to deny or to weaken it, but to make it more capacious and wider. I could go on, but I won't. This was just a quick remark to make a case for my first point. That is, studying the Jesuits is good for you, as my students would say, if you are a historian of early modern Catholicism. Now, my second point is that studying the Jesuits is critical not only if you are a historian of Catholicism, but indeed if you are a historian of early modernity, period. Early modernity simply cannot be studied in isolation from religion. Those who do make two mistakes. One, they buy into the ideological principle according to which modernity equals secularization. Since this principle does not work as an accurate way to describe modernity, the first mistake is simply choosing a wrong way to identify modernity. The second mistake is attributing a modern principle, faulty to boot, to the early modern world. The first mistake is ideological, the second is historical. If we manage to avoid both of those mistakes, we will see that religion is a fundamental component of early modernity and modernity. This doesn't mean that all early modern historians must be historians of religion, but it does mean that all early modern historians who ignore religion risk missing a crucial component of the period they seek to understand. Now, if we agree that religion is an important part of the history of early modernity, then we will see that the Jesuits played a central role in early modernity, as they were right in the thick of the unfolding of this particular history. I could make many examples, but I will only make 4. One, which is well known, is the history of early modern and modern political thought. There is a faulty but surprisingly resilient account of the trajectory of European political thought in which religion is what the modern liberal and enlightened reason is up against. Once modern reason manages to finally kick religion away like a bad habit, then European political thought can become fully modern. And the few individuals who use their secularized reason before the times were ripe can finally be recognized for the heroes they truly are. But as I said, if we free ourselves from the 2 mistakes I mentioned before, we will see that ideas and concepts that we consider as cornerstones of modern political thought developed thanks to, not despite, theology. They were discussed, elaborated, and in some cases conceptualized first by Catholic theologians, and more specifically by Jesuit theologians. Just to keep 2 authors I know well, here the names that come to mind are again Bellarmine, Suarez, Mariana, Becanus. Reading their work, we find mature and sophisticated discussion concerning contract theory, the origin and nature of rights, the limits and necessity of power, the meaning of community. To be sure, the point I'm trying to make is not that the Jesuits invented the modern concepts of right, power, and community. Rather, my point is that if we study power, rights, and community, we cannot ignore the Jesuits. Now, Thomas Hobbes, who was a smart man and lucky enough to be alive before it was possible to make those 2 mistakes, noticed the importance and centrality of the Jesuits' contributions to political thought. One wishes all of Hobbes' readers exhibited the same acumen. The second area of early modern history in which historians are recently rediscovering the contribution of the Jesuits is the history of modern science, as again Father Casey mentioned. Once again, traditionally modern science began when the Jesuits' influence ended. In this traditional view, Jesuits and Catholic leadership more generally were what Galileo was up against. But once again, things are changing, and if we look at the history of science and the development of modern science without making those 2 mistakes I mentioned, you'll see that the road to modern science is littered with Jesuits. And I'm not just simply talking about Galileo's teachers and interlocutors, whose role has been explored by historians for a while now, Clavius, Grimberger, Biancani, and all the other Jesuit natural philosophers involved with astronomy and Copernicanism. I'm also referring to a large number of other Jesuit thinkers whom we are slowly getting to know, thanks to recent scholarship. Examples include Honoré Fabry, who gave important contributions to the debate concerning Aristotelian and Cartesian view of matter, Petavius and his work on chronology. Of course, chronology is a field of growing interest for intellectual and cultural historians, and while the pioneering work in the field has centered on Scaliger, Petavius is rapidly rising to the attention of scholars as well. And Francesco Cangiamila, who played an important role in the 18th century debates on embryology and human reproduction. And in fact, in 2 months, a colleague of mine who is a historian of medicine at UCLA is editing Cangiamila's treatise, Sacred Embryology. And in 2 months, we are going to Yale to have a workshop to explore all the implications of Cangiamila's work on embryology. As you have certainly noted, the names I just mentioned include both well-known Jesuit intellectuals and members of the society whom we might tempted to define as minor. This mix is important, insofar as it is a testament of the larger, some might say outsized even, role that the society as a whole played, which in turn is yet another testament to the unique features of the Society of Jesus as an institution and an organism, not just sort of the greatest hits, in the context of early modern history. I do not need to spend much time discussing the last 2 examples I want to mention, given that here you are all familiar with them. And in fact, you at this institute are at the forefront of the scholarship on these issues. One has to do with the global turn, or with the attention that is increasingly being paid to global non-European history. The point of this new direction, as I see it, is not so much that of centering our research in another part of the world that is in Europe, but rather that of understanding the early modern world without the usual dichotomy between center and periphery. Instead, we might be better off talking about localities, interacting with each other in different social, political, economic, intellectual, and cultural networks. Well, even as we look at this new historiographical landscape, the Jesuits appear front and center. The project on the Indipete that your colleagues here are spearheading in this institute is a testament to that. Once again, the Indipete provide not simply a new lens through which we can look outside and beyond Europe, but also a model of a network in which localities interact and connect with each other. And again, of course, when you're talking about missions, the Roman center is indeed the center. But as Simon Ditchfield said, the relationship between Rome and the missions is not a broadcast receiving model, but rather there was a two-way street of collaboration between the missionary centers and the Roman center. Finally, my last example comes from a field that is also increasingly important, history of knowledge, with a particular focus on the history of books, material culture, and all the channels through which knowledge spreads. This is a relatively recent historiographical development, traditionally anchored to and following from studies centering on humanism, philology, and the history of erudition. Its protagonists traditionally are non-theologians. And in fact, traditionally, again, theology as a system of knowledge was supposed to be different and hostile, if not altogether antithetical, to textual criticism, philology, source criticism, and all the other tools that humanism championed. And yet, Jesuits are primed to occupy an important space in this field as well, as scholars are finally taking more and more seriously the Jesuits' innovative way of merging humanist erudition and scholastic education, and the crucial role that the society and its documents played in the history of knowledge. Here, another name that comes to mind immediately is, of course, Antonio Possevino, who is the protagonist of yet another exciting collaborative project also housed here, as well as the cutting-edge work you guys are doing on Jesuit education and pedagogy. So far I said the study of the Jesuits is important if you are a historian of early modern Catholicism, and also if you are a historian of early modernity period. My third point is that studying the Jesuits is crucial because it is an immensely rewarding experience for any historian, regardless of chronological and geographical focus, methodological approach, and expertise. As I began to appreciate personally almost 30 years ago, the Jesuits' tradition of record keeping is unparalleled. One needs to set foot in the RC to realize that the society was committed to the preservation of the past, not just its own past, and not simply for the sake of posterity. Anybody who reads Daniello Bartoli or one of the myriad local Jesuit historiographers will notice that for the Jesuits, the past is necessary to make sense of the present, not simply to leave testimonies for the future. Few other religious orders or communities of any kind had the same historical self-awareness that the Jesuits had, the same awareness there is of their own place in history and the necessity of articulating, reaffirming, and demonstrating the place in history by means of collecting and archiving documents. Early modern Jesuits knew, in a sense, there was a calling that transcended time and place. And in fact, every Jesuit asking to go to the Indies knew that the best possible outcome would be to become another Xavier. And yet they also knew that each incarnation of Xavier had a specific historical context to face, and in turn, it could bend, as it were, space and time in a specific and unique way. Jesuit historians also appreciated fully the power of narrative, not only to keep the world on record, but also to create new worlds. Traditional scholarship generally dismissed the Jesuits, or for that matter, any other Catholic or Protestant historiography, because it was confessionally partisan, on the assumption that good history writing could only happen when the historian has no religious or ideological stand, as if this condition were ever possible. Recent scholars are revisiting this view, showing that Jesuit historiography could be, and often was, both partisan and erudite, ideologically motivated and historiographically exemplary. Recent scholars are also recentering the importance of the Jesuit tradition of record keeping and highlighting its larger implications for the history of knowledge and history of political culture. The tension between the eternal and the historical, the awareness of the power of narrative, the manifold links between the past, the present, and the future, all these are important features of Jesuit historiography, and I would think that reflecting on them is not just necessary to understand early modern historiography, but also a useful practice as we reflect on our own approach to history writing. In conclusion, let me come briefly to my fourth and final point. Studying the Jesuits is simply a lot of fun, whatever your profession. I still remember, as I think many other people in this room, reading John O'Malley's The First Jesuits for the first time. Like all the readers, I too noted the unbelievably sophisticated scholarship, the luminous sparks of wit and intelligence, the treasure trove of insights for understanding early modern history that the book provided. But in addition to all those things, I also thought that the history of the society that O'Malley told was simply an amazing story. A story of faith and resilience, of succeeding and failing and trying again, a story of bravery and fear and commitment and vision, a story of saying yes when called and not taking no for an answer, a story that brought me to all corners of the earth, from the upper echelon of power to the most humble homes, from exotic faraway lands back to my own hometown of Messina. A story that seemed superhuman at times, but also intensely and profoundly human. I remember feeling sad when I finished the book, because I didn't want the story to end. And in some ways, I think that my whole career is an attempt to give just a small contribution to keep the story going. Thank you.
So thank you, Stefania. So in praise of the Wade Street gang that Father Casey has been building around, we can switch to Italian right now, and the conversation will be held in that language. So I'm Cristiano Casalini. I'm a research scholar at the Institute, and thank you for your wonderful presentation, Stefania. Our plan, my plan with Emanuele today is just to have a couple of questions for you, more autobiographical in this sense, and then open up discussion and conversation with the public here. I'm sure that you have lots of questions for her. So the title of your talk is Research in Context, right? Jesuit Studies in Context. And I would like to bring this idea of context into the reality of your formative years. So in honor again of the Italian community, I would like you to tell us. And actually, Grandler was a disappointment because he anticipated, once again, my own questions. It's always leading the way. So what does it mean to enter Jesuit studies in Italy, in the context also of prestigious institutions like the Scuola Normale di Pisa, one of the most prestigious higher education institution in Italy, one that was founded actually by Napoleon, and then became one of the most important institutions in the Risorgimento, and then it was reformed by Giovanni Gentile, the philosopher and minister of the fascist regime. And all these situations had one thing in common, that were mostly anti-clerical. So what does it mean to, develop an interest in Catholic studies, and particularly in the Jesuits, in environments such as the one in Italy that had this fierce contraposition between at least two cultures, I would say?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's an excellent question. And I would say, I started school in the late 90s. And by that time, I think the ideological polarization between anti-clericalism and sort of Marxist historiography on the one hand, and clerical historiography or confessional historiography on the other, were not as relevant to our studies as they must have been, 20 years before even. The Scuola Normale I entered, an incredibly illustrious tradition of early modern religious history. The great figure, protagonist, was Delio Cantimori, right? Author of the Eretici Italiani del Cinquecento. It was this massive seminal work on Italian heretics in the 16th century. And one thing that Cantimori and his students, one of them was Adriano Prosperi, was my advisor. The other one was Carlo Ginzburg, who also was my advisor. They were all students of Cantimori. So one thing that Cantimori did really well, masterfully in fact, was to understand this period of Italian history in its complexity without being swayed one way or the other by making a judgment. So in that respect, sure, the concern of what does it do to Italian modernity is there, but more of a concern was to understand what this period meant. The Catholic Church in Italy in early modern times and modern times was a force to be reckoned with. So before we despise it or embrace it, can we try to understand it? So one thing that I learned from my professors, and from the spirit of Delio Cantimori that you could still feel, he was dead by the time, of course, I started studying, but he was still alive, was that before you judge, you need to understand. So that spirit was always present. Catholic Church is a big deal. In Italy is a big deal. Regardless how you feel about this, it remains a big deal. So can we try to understand, just to what extent this is a big deal? This is about early modern Catholicism. About Jesuits, it's interesting. So Jesuits, I remember, when I went to college, I went to talk about my project. I wanted to do religion, early modern studies, and I asked my professor to suggest a topic. And I said, I really grew up in a small village close to Messina. I've never seen the world. I want to see the world. And he said, okay, you're going to study the Jesuits. And it really is true. Like, I just kind of went along for the ride. But I think the other reason why he wanted me to study the Jesuits, and that, like I said, the RC was the first archive I visited when I was 20, was that the Jesuits had the commitment to document keeping and document reading and document analyzing, that in my school, where there was a premium on erudition and critical thinking, was considered to be very high. So at that time, the director of the RC was Father Mario Zanardi. I don't know how many of you remember him or have known him, but he had this tradition of giving an exam to all the students who wanted to go to the archive. Nowadays you want to go to archive, you have the letter of reference, you're your professor, and you're fine. But Mario Zanardi always wanted to see you and give you the exam. We were terrified, right? So the exam, we knew it contained an element and moment where he asked us if we did paleography, and check. I did 1 year of paleography with Armando Petrucci, was the best paleographer, arguably, it was fine. And then questions about the history of the society and your project. So, we study hard, we go there, and I remember, he smiled, he seemed good, but we were still terrified. And then he gave you this list of questions, and he gave you an exam. And if you pass, you're allowed to go to the archive. If you don't pass, you're not allowed to go to the archive. And, I passed. I go to the archive, and I'm feeling like $1 million, right? Because, what can go wrong? So I ask for my documents, I wait, the documents arrive, I cannot read a word. I spent 1 year doing paleography, and this one guy's handwriting, Robert Persons, a Jesuit who was an English missionary, I just couldn't read. So I'm looking this defeated. Lo and behold, Mario Zanardi, Father Zanardi, goes back into the room, and he says, what's the matter? And I didn't want to cry, but I think I almost did. And I said, I cannot read this document. And he said, come with me. So he takes with his hand, I had gloves, I was scared because these documents. He takes the documents, takes me back to the office where, half an hour ago he grilled me on the history of the Jesuits. And he tells me, it's okay, just look at this and the words will emerge. And I said, really? Really? Relax, you're fine. Just look at it and the words will emerge. 20 minutes later, I see an L and then an E. And then an N. And I can tell the difference between an N and an M. And at the end of that day, I transcribed one letter. Now, this is the Jesuit historiography in a nutshell, right? You go to the archives prepared. That's why Mario Zanardi gave you the exam. It wasn't mean, it was good for you. You just don't improvise it. This is not amateur hour. You want to go to an archive, you have to know what you have to know. But at the same time, there are things that you don't expect. And you got to roll with it, You're not omniscient. You can prepare, but you don't know anything. Just give it a try. And words do appear. So I think another reason why we were all encouraged to study the Jesuits was to appreciate the beauty of erudition, the beauty of knowing your stuff, but also the power of rolling with it, that you don't know everything, and you will, and it's fine, and you take your time, and you put in the time, and you put in the work, and in the end, things work out. So that's a lesson I pass on to my students. And I think, Mario Zanardi is dead and I miss him. I get dedicated to him my first book because I cannot tell you how impressive that was. You can imagine, I'm 20 years old. The feelings of this roller coaster of a day was just very intense. But I pass it on and I always remember him. I always tell my students about Father Zanardi. And again, that is part of Jesuit studies, aside of all the ideological positions that you can take, this is also what Jesuit studies is about, preparing for and embracing what you don't know, preparing, knowing as much as you can, and just be honest with what you don't know, and things will work out.
I have a quick follow-up question here because it's very interesting, this story, and then I leave the mic to Emanuele. You spoke about the archives, and obviously there might be also a reason why so many Italians are doing Jesuit studies, because the archive is great, right? And it's centralized and the like. But you have been in many archives in Rome. I'm not asking you the story of how you landed in the apartment of the prefect of the Inquisition,
no,
because
don't
you
ask.
were telling that earlier,
No.
but that's okay. How comparatively the Jesuit archives are, in terms of organization, in terms of services, in terms of preservation of the memory, with regard to other archives of other religious orders or the Vatican ones?
Yeah, honestly, there is no competition. Part of the way in which, as you know better than I do, the way in which the society organizes its material was already in the early modern times innovative and meaningful in a way that other archives are not. So if you go, for example, the Inquisition archive, the cataloging system is a mess. In the Jesuit archive, it's perfect. So in part is that tradition of record keeping I'm talking about, and in part, frankly, is the tradition of archivists and librarians. Again, this is you know this better than I do, but this is a religious order that puts a premium on education, on understanding the importance of its own history and other people's history, and that shows. So if I send a student to the RC, I know that whatever difficulties she or he may face, they will get guidance from very knowledgeable people who have a passion for what they do, but mostly they have a passion for teaching young people to deal with that. And there is young people, I send them from California, right? This is young people who are different in many ways from background than what they might have grown up with, but nevertheless, the mission of teaching, in effect, works. So I would say the combination of a very reasonable, meaningful, organic way of preserving the documents and the ability, the prowess, the intelligence, the commitment of the people make the RC a delightful place. And like I said, this is usually my first go-to for students because, other archives have a very hard landing. You get librarians who really don't know. In America, you're lucky. You have a tradition of librarians that is incredible. But in Italy, we're not that lucky. Still, a lot of librarians are mostly people who carry documents rather than people who read them or they know them. So other archives, you send them, and they have a question. Nobody knows the answer, even though they're nice. Italian people are usually nice, right? We're all super nice. But if you don't know the answer, you don't know the answer. With RC, somebody always knows the answer. You cannot go wrong. And so, yeah, that's I'm a fan.
Thank you very much. Emanuele.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Stefania. Thank you, everyone. My name is Emanuele Colombo. I joined the family of Boston College a couple of months ago. And I agree with you. It's great fun studying the Jesuits. My question for you is about the second part of your journey. So you were talking about traveling all over the world. Jesuits brought you from Messina, a small university, to UCLA, huge university, huge research university, and a large history department where, you know, when you go into the website, it seems that there is not great interest for the kind of theological, intellectual history you write about. So my question is about American academia and your experience here with your colleagues, with your students. What does it mean to study Bellarmine and write about Bellarmine and discuss Bellarmine in a large research university in the United States? And what does it mean to teach the fascinating story you are telling us to American students today?
Thank you. Yeah, it's very different from where I grew up, right? So, you know, where I grew up in Italy, at Scuola Normale, there is a lot of things you can take for granted. The fact that Catholicism is a big deal, you take it for granted. The fact that scholarship requires erudition, you take it for granted. Latin, you take it for granted. Really, I grew up in a small village. I went to school in Messina, all public schools. I started Latin at the age of 10. That is not an experience I share with my students who come from California, from, you know, the California public system and often private system as well, right? So in Italy, you can take a lot of things for granted, but in America you cannot. So Catholicism, in the world of in my world of academia, in my corner of academia, Catholicism is not a big deal, right? The Jesuits, most people don't know what they are. Latin is not where to be found. Yet people are interested, right? Because I think by virtue of the fact that the Jesuits are so crucial in all of these different and wider contexts, the Jesuits are interesting, even if you don't know much about the Jesuits, even if you don't know much about early modern history, even if you don't know much about, you know, Latin rhetoric. So I decided when I moved, I remember, you know, I always tell this story, just to give you an example. I love my students, I love my life, been in California 20 years. But, you know, one day I was lecturing on Luther. Yeah, no, transubstantiation, consubstantiation. I had this PowerPoint on with a portrait of Luther, one of those Lucas Cranach, you know, portrait. And this was a 350 student class. So one of them raises his hand. So one of the TAs goes to the mic, and imagine the scene. This is 350 students, kid raises his hand, interrupts me. I say, you know, do you have a question? He says, yeah, I do. Is that portrait faithful? So I start talking about, you know, the tradition of Dutch portrait versus Florentine portraits, but I can tell this is not where we're going. We're not going anywhere. So I stop myself and I ask the student, sorry, why do you ask? And he says, oh, no, nothing. I thought Martin Luther was black. So Loyola is not an household name, right? In a context in which Martin Luther and Martin Luther King are not so clearly differentiated. So when this happened, I'm thinking I have a choice. You know, I can think my life sucks or I can embrace it. And I did. I embraced it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to teach the Jesuits like that. It's wonderful to talk with colleagues who have never heard about the Jesuits and see that they care. So we have symposia going on. You know, one of them, you are participating in 2 months at UCLA. We've got a new field of religion within the history department. Thanks to the effort of many people, my effort to meet people where they're at, and you find that the issues that the Jesuits were behind are of a great, immense interest if you just learn to connect. This is not a world where you can take things for granted. This is not a world in which we share the same background that I had, that I share with my professors, but this is a beautiful world full of enthusiasm and full of creative energy. And so I decided that it was fun to make it my mission to take this part of my life that I care so much about and just let other people see why is it so awesome. And you do that by meeting them where they're at. So, you know, global history, bang, we're here, right? Many of my colleagues wouldn't think about Jesuits when they think about global issues, yet you tell them about the Indipete, they see it immediately. And so suddenly there is interest. I was telling you earlier, so we have, we have an incredible rare book library, which has a huge budget. Most of that budget was spent in Italian Renaissance work. In fact, at UCLA, you have the largest collection of Aldine in the world. There is the edition made by Aldo Manuzio. No? If you are a Renaissance book person, UCLA is really the place to be. As of 3 years ago, we decided to switch. Because, nobody really cares about Manuzio. How many times can you read Erasmus's edition by Manuzio? So we changed our acquisition policy, and you know what we got first? The biggest collection of papers by Jesuit missionaries in the Philippines. This is done by a rare book librarian with he was a sinologist from Harvard by background. He had no interest in Jesuit studies per se, but he understood that in this world of global connections, he wanted to acquire primary documents. He ends up with Jesuit missionary in the Philippines. So this is the beginning of the new and improved rare book collections at UCLA on Jesuits in the Philippines. Who would have thought, from Manuzio to Jesuits in the Philippines? So yeah, the future is bright, but we gotta change things. I cannot do my work the way my professors did their work and the way I used to do the work when I was in college and in graduate school. But this new world I like, and I think there is a lot of people who are interested and excited, and so am I.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Bart.
The Jesuit tradition of preserving its documents has always been interesting to me, and I've wondered about the reason for it. So Polanco, Ignatius's secretary, was a huge pack rat, right? And so for 10 years as Ignatius's secretary, anything Ignatius wrote, he saved, right? And he continued that tradition for the next several superior generals. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, to what extent might that have been the legacy of Polanco? Or are there any documents that you're aware of in that early period which self-consciously express this need to preserve our documentation?
That's a great question. And I think that, Polanco's influence loomed large in this kind of tradition. But I also think pretty soon it became an ethos of the society to preserve, right? And again, the thing that I find striking, so everybody wants to keep track of themselves, and especially if you're a young religious order, right? You have no history. You're not like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, they've got 300 years behind you. You're basically newborn. So in part, people assume that that tradition of record keeping is what a young religious order does to give itself legitimacy. And I suspect that Polanco, for example, and the early phase of record keeping was mostly about that, kind of like, look, we might not have a history, but we do a long one, but we have one, and this is it. But I think soon enough the Jesuits understood, and Pierre-Antoine Fabre has beautiful reflections on this, but the Jesuits understood that when you have a vision, so it's good to have a history, but you also need a future. And this part again is kind of what I was saying with myself. It's great to have a history, but you need to make your future. And I think what the Jesuits did, they understood that when you're making a future, you need to tell a story, a vision of how this future will be. So preserving documents, paradoxically, was not simply a way to have a history, but also to have a future, to have the kind of visionary model. You see this in missions, you see political theory, for example, right? You are building this new world, whether the world of intellectual structure, of really a new, brave Catholic world. You need vision, you need a plan. So history becomes an aid for that plan, to make it happen. You see it, you make it before it's actually there. And so in that respect, like Pierre-Antoine Fabre would argue, every single document produced by the Jesuits, starting from 1580s, 1590s, right, when at this point we are here to stay. Yes, we are a young order, but we've got our chops. Every single document was a work of preservation, insofar as it was a work of visionary planning, Thank you.
Malik.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I just wanted to reflect with you, or maybe ask you to reflect on another dimension of kind of the Jesuit history, which is not the global, but the very local. I was thinking of you being in California. I mean, what could be more important to the history of California than the Jesuits? I mean, who settled Baja California and the Camino Real? I mean, their imprint is all over the state of California. And I'm just wondering, as a Californian now for 20 years, how has that history resonated or not with you, with your students, with how you think about your work as an historian?
Yeah, so, thank you. It's a good question, and it's quite interesting. I should say my students do not know this. The Camino Real, this is not something that, they know what it is. They don't know that part. And I think in part is the regrettable decentering of European history from California public school curricula. So you would think you live in California, there is Jesuits, there is missions everywhere, and yet you don't really know what these things are. When you do know what they are, you do know that they are a tool of oppression, right? This is California, this is 2024, this is the time where, indigenous rights are being talked about as something to preserve. So the few who do know about the Catholic missionaries in California, often they have this view of them simply as an oppressive force with respect to the indigenous communities. So how do you talk about this? First of all, you have to teach what these things are. And again, I go back to this issue of complexity. Very few things in history or in life are all good or all bad. So you want to get away from the caricature, these missionaries that you don't really know even what they are, but they're sort of oppressive. Well, who is oppressing what? What is going on there? But this is to say that the Camino Real is as exotic for my students in California as it might be for your students in Boston. So this is what I mean. You cannot take anything for granted, right? You would think, gee, you live in California. How is that? It's not, because I think the landscape has a lot of traces, but the historical preservation is being cut. So there is no channel. So yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. You start from scratch. You see where you're at, and you do it again. But it's a challenge, frankly, that I embrace. So, we're starting this project with people in art history, and it's about Jesuit churches imageries in Southern California and kind of northern. I have a student working on it in northern Mexico. And the idea is that to put together Jesuit iconography with labor migrations, local dynamics of patronage, again, to try to move away from these cowboy and Indians, right? The evil missionaries and the good indigenous people, and rather let's see how those communities work together. And we find that when we're dealing with art product in churches, it's very easy to see because, those art works are pretty interesting mix of motif that comes straight from sort of the missionary tradition, but also from the indigenous context. So that's one example where you just go back to square one and just you embrace complexities and little by little in a way, but not as important as you would think. Thank you.
I found the comment very interesting about the Jesuits having a vision, and that's why their documentation is sort of collected and driven. At the same time, I was thinking, at least in the case of Ignatius, the fear of being an alumbrado, the constant pressure on the early society of having to defend yourself, plus the fact that he himself, as a young man, the family was trying to get together an entailed estate, and they had to collect documents, that this drive for documentation was partly, going back to him at least, a response to the sense of being threatened. Is that your understanding as well, or are we off on that?
No, very much so. So, I think for Ignatius, you are of course right on, but I think I would go even further than that. See, in early modern times, right, genealogy was always a tool to defend yourself, self-aggrandizing, if you like, and also defending yourself, right? So, you have this proliferation of genealogies in the early modern times. I'm talking about individuals or families, not religious orders. So you would, invent in some cases, and in some cases document ancestors. You want to make a story. You want to, so that you are impermeable to the twist of fate as much as you can. So I think history, preserve, there is a reason why I think the English word, in English, the word preserving means both defending and maintaining. So there is always an element of, this is what we are, don't touch us. Set the record straight. I think that is true for the Jesuits. It's true for any historical enterprise. You can make examples, left and right today of the use of history as a defense mechanism, to just sort of defend your own position. But I think what the Jesuits do is to take advantage of the potential more fully than other communities, right? So they don't stop of the defense. They use it for the attack, right? So the vision is the attack part in a way. So it's a good tool to defend yourself from accusations, to set the record straight, but also to kind of go on the offensive. But definitely the element is present. I would say, yeah, you're right, of course, about Ignatius, but you're also right about many other things. I mean, history is a complicated matter as historians, right? History serves a lot of purposes. History is fascinating, is dangerous, is powerful. And I think the Jesuits understood better than most, earlier than most, all of those facets of history, the kind of shield, the spear, the edges of history. It's quite an interesting lesson for us, all the things you could do with the past. And if you don't do it, the past does you.
We're at the top of the hour, and I want to thank Stefania for her presence. At UCLA, they're on quarters, so their school year had just started recently. So for your taking time to join us at the beginning of the academic year is a super kindness, and we're delighted to have you. You've honored us with your presence. I want to call attention, too, to the programming of the Institute. We have a symposium on Jesuit Studies in Lima, Peru at the end of May. We have a call for papers for that symposium. If that's something that's of interest, you might take a look at that. You can learn about our fellows. Their biographies are in the handout. And we're just so grateful for your presence. Would you join me in another round of applause for Stefania?
Thank you very much.